Hello.
Hello.
Hi, Stella.
Hello, Max.
How
So
are you?
excited for for your talk. I'm great. How are you?
Truthfully, I have a headache right now. We love a Mars transit. The moon applying to Mars, truly. Um, no, but I just popped an Advil, so we're hoping this is going to clear up. But I'm feeling good. I just woke up from a nap because I was like, if I don't take a nap, I won't be able to. My body will not be able to operate. But I am excited. I'm excited to talk about Saturn and Pisces. We are at 9 o'clock, so do you think we should get started?
I think that this is a perfect time.
Okay, perfect, perfect. Well, welcome everyone to KazimiCon. My name is Blaze, and I am going to be your panelist for the next 2 hours. We're going to be talking about Saturn and Pisces, and well, not just Saturn and Pisces, but just Saturn in general and the motion of Saturn. Because in about 27 hours from now, on October 23rd at 12:07 a.m. Eastern, Saturn will finally station direct at 18 degrees and 35 minutes of Aquarius. So, moving forward, the planet that basically runs my life, and I'm pretty sure most of ours, if you are also in here as well too. Moving forward, it's going to be getting ready to prepare to exit Aquarius, and it's really Saturn's been here since March 22nd, 2020. It stayed here until July 1st, 2020, retrograded back into Capricorn, and then by December 17th, 2020, Saturn officially entered Aquarius, where it has been here ever since. And um, we will talk a lot about Saturn in terms of its significations and other things that it represents in a moment. But moving forward, now that Saturn's finally direct, it's going to be getting ready to make its exit out of Aquarius. And so moving forward, really from March, not March, I mean, yes, March, but not what I was going to say. From October 23rd up until March 7th, 2023, this will be kind of our last round or our last hurrah of Saturn in Pisces. And Saturn will be here at the most up until 2025, but completely leaving by 2026. And so the goal of this talk is to just kind of set up an outline of what types of changes we can expect with Saturn, since it does move very slowly through the zodiac. It only travels around 2 arc minutes a day, but taking 2.5 years to travel through each zodiac sign, and then 30 years to do a complete revolution through the zodiac. So today, what we're going to be talking about, we're going to break this down into around four-ish segments. We're going to be setting up some significations of Saturn in the beginning, talking about Saturn's essential nature, what it does as it travels through the zodiac, what kind of effects it brings as it moves through the different signs and through the different houses. We're then going to be setting up a timeline of Saturn in Pisces. Oh my gosh, I'm really gonna put this. Yeah, we're gonna set up a timeline of Saturn and Pisces. So we're gonna look at some of the more major transits or some of the more, I guess, eventful encounters Saturn will experience while it moves through this sign. So we'll be looking at 2023, 2024, and 2025, and just kind of going over those highlights. Very briefly, of course, this is like I said, I always do the week ahead horoscope, and so every Monday you can kind of get tuned in into these weekly updates. So if you're looking to get more of these weekly updates as we go through Saturn and Pisces over the next few years, but you know for however long, not even just for Saturn and Pisces. Subscribe to the newsletter. We actually just hit 3,000 subscribers here, so definitely a big milestone, and I'm so excited to welcome more of you. Oh my gosh! I love the soundboard so much. Um, but yeah, I'm so excited to welcome more of you, brilliant, amazing faces and people to on this journey of the astro weather with me. So, um, I think what we should get started with talking about is some of the significations and the meanings of Saturn. And I have realized, and I think this is the part of Saturn that is going to be really interesting to talk about too. I have realized over the years how intimate of a relationship I have with Saturn. Whether it be as my malefic out of sect, who is the most challenging planet in my chart, whether it be Saturn being Saturn, as Saturn is iconically known for, or whether it be actually trying to put into the work and effort to develop that relationship with Saturn. I want to go over a few kind of details and little tidbits of information of what Saturn is. So to kind of start off with Saturn's nature, Saturn is a cold and a dry planet, and so it's typically when we talk about it's all the planets and everything in astrology, there is some sort of elemental association with them, and so when we talk about both Mars and Saturn as malefic planets, they share this nature of dryness, but Mars will typically get this extremity of heat, whereas Saturn will get the extremity of cold. However, Saturn does have a kind of quality that can change. It is a cold planet, but its dryness can sometimes change into wetness. Because it is cold and dry, it is associated with the melancholic temperament, and it is an earth. It kind of has an earthic quality. Saturn can typically be a little bit more dark or a little bit more dim as a star in the sky, so it's not going to be completely the brightest star in the sky. The colors that it does represent are black with a hint of yellow. As a malefic planet, it is the greater in fortune, so it represents things that are not supportive towards life or do not support the flow of life, such as the extreme coldness or the extreme dryness, which can kind of leave something very barren or very disconnected or lifeless, like trees that are left without leaves, for example. In terms of the days that Saturn governs over Saturdays, but also Wednesday nights as well too. The years that Saturn has, its minor years are 30, its mean years are 43.5, its greater years are 56, and its greatest years are 256. Its body, in terms of its orb, is 9 degrees. And some of the core significations that Saturn gets is one, its association with land, its association with agriculture, with farmers, with landowners, with buildings, with monuments, and specifically the allotting or the dividing of the land. We have also a big signification with Saturn is water, and I think it's really interesting too how some of the ancient astrologers, one of the things that they often love to prophesize is the end of the world and the end of times. And so if I'm pretty sure if it was all the planets that conjoined in the sign of Cancer, the world would end in fire. If versus if they conjoined in Capricorn, the world would end in water. And so typically we do see this association with Saturn as being about water, whether it be running water, wells, the sea, the ocean. There is connotations around Saturn in terms of like injuries and harm that can be brought by Saturn, such as drowning or kind of constriction. We see shipwrecks also kind of associated with Saturn too. So this connotation with the sea, this connotation with the vastness of the sea, with floods, with storms, with hails. Saturn also gets connotations with weighing and measuring things. So whether that be the weight of merchants, we'll talk about that in a moment, and Saturn's connection to like Libra and scales and things of that nature. But it also does represent, yes, sailors as well too. In terms of the extremes we have with Saturn, Saturn represents all sorts of limits and it represents all sorts of boundaries. And so with that, we have those limits and those polarizations of excessive wealth and excessive poverty at the same time too. And I think this is a big thing to kind of talk about with Saturn as a planet, is that it is a malefic planet, but let's kind of demystify what does malefic mean. When we're talking about anything benefic or anything malefic in astrology, we're ultimately describing the conduciveness to life. And so with Jupiter and with Venus, we have these qualities of warmth and heat with Jupiter, for example. And obviously we need heat to be alive. We need heat for our body to be in equilibrium. But then we also need the wetness. We need the moisture of Venus to help us give fluidity. I mean, our body is made up of so much water and so much moisture. And so these two planets coming together, their qualities of heat and wetness are able to make life grow. However, the malefic planets, they can also be called infortunes as well, too. I think infortune is a much I guess, accurate word for what the malefics are trying to describe, is that they're things less conducive to life. So, like, as I said earlier, when we have Mars as our infortune, Mars takes this quality of heat and makes it burning and makes it scorching. The sun can also do this as well, too. It's the sun, by some ancient astrologers, it's considered malefic. But with Saturn, we have Saturn being this extremity of cold, so it consolidates, it condenses, and it can even freeze sometimes, too. In terms of how this is symbolically understood as a malefic planet, it brings things to it kind of polarizes things, but it brings things to extreme. So in this case of wealth or poverty, we see these limits of what kind of the boundaries of what these represent associated here. But also a big thing that I love that Dr. Olomi touches on this, especially in their episode on Saturn on their Patreon, is that Saturn talks about specifically the poor, it talks about persecution, and it talks about oppression. But a lot of the time, when we're talking about Saturn, we're talking about, I guess, this planet being a witness to the different types of oppression and the different types of persecution, the different groups of people experience, whether that do be through poverty, whether it be through injustice, whether it be through alienation, whether it be through isolation or captivity or binding. A lot of these things are the things that Saturn represents, but Saturn does not inherently represent what is. Saturn itself is not inherently corrupt. Saturn is just the omen of the corrupt actions that humans do, and I think that's always the important thing to remember about astrology, especially when we talk about the malefics. The real evil is in people's actions, not in the planets themselves. The planets are omens to let us know what actions people are taking and whether they are being more conducive towards bringing harmony or more conducive towards bringing extremity. And so Saturn will get these connotations definitely of imprisonment, captivity, binding, chains as well too. Whether the binding, whether it be literally being bound, or whether it be binding agreements such as law, legal things, contracts. We see all these things kind of associated with Saturn as well too. In terms of professions, some of the things that Saturn is said to represent are thieves, grave robbers, which I always think is really interesting. Diggers, so we see this connection back to the land and back to things that are underneath the earth, but we'll touch on a little bit why specifically grave robbers. We see blacksmiths, masons, porters, cleaners, tanners, magicians, again, people who are workers of the land. We have outcasts. We have thieves, and again, we have diggers of wells and ditches. We'll kind of go into those in a little bit in a moment. In terms of traveling, though, Saturn does get these connotations of travel, but specifically absence from homeland. It does represent immigrants, foreigners, travelers, sojourners, and any sort of long or extended period away from the home. There also is this connotation of, whether it be home, but this disconnect from family as well, too, and this disconnect from I don't think I have to extrapolate on what family means, but that disconnect from family. And so whether that be through literally leaving the homeland or actually leaving family is something that is also associated with Saturn as well, too. In terms of its character, Saturn is said to sometimes have excessive ego. Saturn can be very cunning. It can hold a lot of grudges. Sometimes we can see falsehood and deceit associated with Saturn, so whether that be lies. Other times it can indicate greed or envy of others. A big thing that Saturn indicates, though, is silence or the scarcity of words. Scarcity is also another just general keyword for Saturn. They do say, though, that some of the things for Saturn is that they do really hate the people that they don't like. So Saturn takes that cold kind of consolidating and inhibitive nature and exacerbates it. The coldness of Saturn, whether that be the disconnect or the freezing nature that Saturn can bring. Saturn can definitely hold grudges. They can be very self-disciplined, very strong-minded, but they're also very serious, grave, and somber at the same time, too. In terms of some of the virtues that Saturn does have, though, because Saturn is a malefic planet, but there are instances where, based on the condition that Saturn is in the chart, it can represent things like wisdom, patience, honesty, justice, diplomacy. Saturn can be methodical in action. It can be contemplative. And one of the things I think is also the most interesting about Saturn is that they are secret keepers, and that they particularly, there's this anecdote that Abu Mashar talks about where they are able to know the thoughts of other people, but they never share their own thoughts on their own. So again, this idea of keeping secrets, whether that be literally just kind of staying silent, but also kind of being this confidant towards other people and providing good counsel as well, too. There is this connotation, though, that Saturn, as much as they are a hater, as Saturn is always hating, they are also someone who is really honest as well, too, and someone who is, when they do esteem someone, this is another thing that Abu Mashar mentions, when they do esteem someone and they do find respect for someone, they mean it very sincerely. And so they do have kind of scarce praising of people, but when it does happen, it is from an honest and a sincere place. We see the profoundness of knowledge, but also the depth of knowledge as well, too, associated with this. We did talk about truth-telling already. These are all virtues that Saturn gives. Saturn also gives the virtue of hidden knowledge, but we'll talk about that in a moment. In terms of illnesses or injuries, Saturn does generally represent old age, so people who are at the end of their life. And so, the harsh the wear and tear of the decades of life will eventually do something to the body, and so Saturn will represent old people for that reason. It represents chronic illnesses as well too, so long lasting or sustaining illnesses and injuries. Again, it can represent sluggishness or inactivity, having to kind of pause, or maybe sometimes we do see that Saturn gets referred to people who are disabled and are not able to perform, whether it be work. I know Valens mentions this in particular, that if actually Mars is trine Saturn, it indicates someone who cannot work or who has to take a break in work in particular. So we do see people who struggle with disabilities, who are dealing with some sort of blockage or thing that inhibits them. We see this through Saturn. We also see that illnesses that are caused from great moisture as well too is one thing that is mentioned about Saturn as well too. In terms of leadership, because Saturn does get connotations of leadership, it talks about those who distribute rule. It talks about those who make kings, but also old leaders in particular. In terms of the feelings that Saturn can sometimes bring, sometimes there is this feeling of defeat that Saturn can bring. It can bring sorrows. It can bring confusion sometimes, usually from the idea of things being obscure or being hidden. This is one of the big things that Saturn represents, is that it's the confusion and the lack of knowledge comes from the obscurity and the nature of Saturn, where we have the sun, for example, the ruler of Leo, the sun who governs over the middle of summer, and the heat of the sun is felt the most during Leo season. Um, Saturn, on the other hand, is the exact opposite. It is the lack of luminance, whereas the sun is the light. Saturn is this principle of darkness, but it is also in the principle of darkness that we find tranquility as well too. Whereas the sun, if you think about the sun, for example, you can't directly look at the sun. In Saturn, we find comfort. Find comfort and tranquility in the darkness. But again, confusion is typically something that can kind of come up Um, after kind of towards the beginning of Saturn transits. It does represent anxiousness as well too, anxiety or fears. These are also things that kind of get associated with Saturn, particularly unformed fears as well too. In terms of knowledge, though, one of the things that always gets associated with Saturn is people who study tradition and people who study traditional sciences. So whether that be the tradition and lineages of astrology, or they're busy, or not busy, but or they're studying, family traditions or traditions that are passed down through generation, through culture. These are all things related to Saturn as well too. People who are sorcerers, people who are magicians, astrologers, talisman makers, hermits, and people who are very self-disciplined and devoted in religion. Saturn also, again, represents ancient things. So whether that be the dead, whether that be genealogy, your lineage, ancestors, buried things, inheritances, also elders as well too. Saturn will represent those people too. Saturn can represent old fathers, grandfathers, and older siblings as well too. And again, like I said, the thing that Saturn can also represent is that it represents hidden knowledge and knowledge of hidden things, such as secrets. But usually they, again, don't share their thoughts with other people. So there is this idea, I guess, of silence or restraint in speech. And this is something especially gets associated with both Capricorn and Aquarius. But these are just some of the basic significations of Saturn. And I think what I ultimately kind of want to talk about now, in terms of what can we expect when Saturn does change signs, is that anytime Saturn is going to go through a sign, it's going to bring these topics, I guess, of slowness. It's going to bring delay, and it's going to bring this idea of needing to bring more foundation or bring more stability to the house that Saturn is moving through in your chart. And so it's important to think about, I guess, the qualities of, I really want to say that, I guess, the past 2.5 years, because Saturn has really been in its own home sign. Saturn has been self-autonomous for the past 2.5 years. And so we're really going to start to get this, I guess, introduction to what kind of changes Saturn is going to bring now that it's not at home, now that it's highlighted this intense rigidity and, highlighted tradition, highlighted old things, highlighted ancient things. We see all these things with Saturn. We're going to start to see, I guess, this nature of the slowness, of the even lethargic nature Saturn can kind of bring, being brought into the sign of Pisces. And so I do want to kind of take a moment to list off some of the significations of Pisces. So we've kind of gone over some of the things that Saturn represents. Saturn, I did want to mention that Saturn is, its two homes that it has in the zodiac is that it is at home in Capricorn. It's also at home in Aquarius. Its exaltation is in the sign of Libra. Its exile is in the sign of Leo and in the sign of Cancer. And the sign that it has its depression or its fall in is in the sign of Aries. There's actually a lot we can extrapolate from these kind of concepts here. For example, Saturn being exalted in the sign of Libra. We have Saturn exalted in the sign of the equinox. So if the sun is said to be exalted in Aries, Saturn, being antithetical to the sun, is exalted in the opposite sign. So where the length of daytime grows and it increases during the equinox, during the Aries ingress, the heat of the sun increases and grows. With Aries, we have the coldness starting to grow and starting to dominate during Libra season. Even now, I mean, it's kind of been really funny because cold temperature has been something that's been trending a lot with Libra season, as it should be, because this is the time when the cold really starts to kick in. But it is the introduction of Saturn that we get here, and we get the fullness of winter when Capricorn season does come around. But in terms of Pisces, it is a water sign. It's a double-bodied sign, so it is, or more commonly known as mutable, or a common sign. It is cold and wet in terms of its sign, so it makes it phlegmatic. It's a nocturnal sign, and it represents the end of winter. I think that end of winter portion is especially interesting for what we talk about when we kind of get into the discussion of Saturn and Pisces and kind of what this vibe is going to feel like. We'll talk about that with its domicile and exaltation scheme in a moment. The virtues of Pisces, though, is that it indicates wisdom. There are contradictions that can kind of be found in Pisces. There's mystery. There's a big theme and topic of love, devotion, and trust, especially associated with Pisces. We get a lot of these from both Jupiter. A lot of these significations come from both Jupiter, but also Venus being exalted here as well, too. We see passion. We see egolessness as well kind of coming in here. So this idea of dissolving the ego or losing the ego, this idea of selflessness and the desire to enmesh the self with the other. We see generosity being a big thing associated with Pisces as well, too, such as sharing. Also, they are said to be agreeable and uplifting as well, too. Pisces as a sign, though, is a mutable sign, so it is adaptive and it is dual in nature. And so this is going to be interesting to think about Saturn when we have Saturn, who is a very fixed and enduring sign, who comes into this mutable sign now and is kind of in this very inconsistent or constantly changing zodiac sign. And I would argue that both Gemini and Pisces are some of the most, I would even argue more Pisces too. Gemini and Pisces are some of the most changeable, mutable signs because they have this very fluid nature to them, both water, and I think this is also something that we're going to eventually compare and contrast this in a moment. But something to kind of take a look at is just, oh my God, what was I talking about? Oh yeah, that the nature of both air and water as elements is that they do share. There is some commonality between them, and the commonality is that they both share the quality of wetness. So the adaptability, the fluidity, the willingness to change. We do see these things associated with wetness, as you know, with water. Water does not have container or does not have a structure. It kind of just spreads out if it's poured everywhere. But I think this is going to be an interesting thing. We're going to talk about Saturn going into the mutable sign. It's also going to be going into a water sign too. So Saturn really has not been in a water sign since 2012 to 2015 when Saturn was last in Scorpio. So this is definitely going to be an interesting kind of completion to Saturn going through the water signs. And I mean, if we think about this period that Saturn has been through the water signs, that was 2003 to 2000. I want to say 2005 or 2006. And then there's 2012 to 2015. And here we are again at 2023 to 2026. Fully, really 2025, but 2026 is when Saturn will officially kind of leave the sign. But we'll talk about water as an element and kind of what Saturn's going to be bringing there. Let's see, in terms of challenges, some of the things that Pisces can sometimes represent is that they can be a little bit unreliable, sometimes with poor time management. The lack of structure can kind of be a little bit challenging, so I think it's going to be interesting to see Saturn kind of come in here and give the Pisces a little bit more discipline, especially because it's a mutable sign. They do change their opinions often or their mind often. As I said earlier, Jupiter and Venus are both of the planets that manage this sign together. So Venus is the exaltation lord and Jupiter is the domicile lord. And one of the things that these planets do bring together is that they do bring devotion, they do bring love, they bring a connection to religion. We'll talk about in a moment. But both of these planets are also associated with comfort as well, too. And so one of the things that Pisces likes a lot is comfort and indulgence. And sometimes they can be prone to overindulgence, whether that be in actual like food or sleep or even drugs or alcohol to a more extreme circumstance. We do see this connection to indulgence being associated with Pisces. But especially, and this is something we're going to come back to especially, is the emphasis on religion, the emphasis on faith, and the emphasis on spirituality. Whereas, and I think of this a lot with both of the Jupiter ruled signs, is that Sagittarius seeks to find God or seeks to find faith outward and to expand and share the vision of faith with others. Pisces is more about finding that internally. And so it's the internal understanding of where there is God or where there is faith or how spirituality can kind of be cultivated. And so definitely very important connection Pisces has to religion because of Jupiter. It also does deal with dreams. It deals with mystics. It deals with those who are faithful, those who are religious. And it also deals with places where holy people gather. It's one of the quotes that's used. The planet that is said to be debilitated here is that Mercury is said to be fallen in Pisces. So what does this mean when Mercury is quote unquote fallen, or any planet is fallen? The whole idea of dignity schemes represents the planet's ability to be supported in bringing about the thing that it represents. So if we think about Mercury, for example, Mercury is able to bring about the thing it represents through clear articulation of knowledge, of facts, of details, of narrowing the mind, of narrowing on those details. Mercury in Pisces, this is where things get a little bit confusing because Mercury isn't able to gain as much clarity on those details. However, one of the things I do love about Mercury in Pisces is, even though, this is where Mercury is said to be fallen, and so traditionally this can be associated with broken messengers or messengers who are unable to complete their job, or, somehow there's something that prevents the message from being able to be delivered. In other ways, this can also be literally a sign of people who are messengers to the gods. This is something some of the Hellenistic astrologers will talk about, that the Mercury in Pisces is the messenger of the gods, as it is in Jupiter's sign. So there is this idea of, I guess, translating or getting information, but again, not necessarily knowing where it's coming from. But a big thing about Pisces especially is poetry, artistry, and the articulating of what cannot be articulated. And I think this is definitely the big contrast we see between Virgo and Pisces, is that Virgo aims to be exact and it aims to be detailed, whereas Pisces is more about, it's more whole and it's more all-encompassing and non-exclusionary, whereas Virgo is not afraid to tell you about the flaws and the things that are out of order, as Mercury tends to do. Mercury tends to take a more, it tends to sympathize with Saturn in that nature, to where it's more dry and it's more cold as well too. But in Pisces, it finds a lot of fluidity in terms of its mind. So typically, this can be indicated as changing your mind a lot, or changing in opinions a lot with Mercury and Pisces. Some of the characteristics, though, again, of just Pisces as a sign. Again, it's changeable in mood. There can be this idea of tending to exert little effort or little work. We do see the benefics are, they do have a much more, they have an association with relaxation here in Pisces and wanting to just chill, whether that be through smoking weed, whether that be through alcohol, whatever the case might be. There is this kind of serious and silly nature that Pisces does have. There is this, again, mutable nature, so double-bodied. They can change or be in a state of emotional fluctuation as a water sign. They do say that they are fond of deep emotional connections, though, and I think this is also something we're going to be kind of going towards as well too. But generosity is a big thing, especially associated with Pisces, as it is a Jupiterian sign. There is, again, this idea of enjoyment of food, and they can get addicted to intoxicants, but also addictive to food as well too. The professions of Pisces can definitely be musicians, they're poets, they're singers, they're healers, they're people who are diviners, and they're people who are the interpreters of dreams. We often see that associated with Jupiter. Pisces also gets linked to the flood as well too. Actually, the flood of Noah. Some of the ancient astrologers postulate that the flood, talked about in the Bible and talked about in other religious texts, is associated with the Saturn-Jupiter conjunction that takes place in Pisces, although there is some dispute on that. Generally, this link to flood and this link to excess and abundance of water is associated with Pisces, whether this is through the abundance of literally the flood, or whether it be through the nourishing rain waters of Pisces. So these are just some of the basic significations of Pisces. But now I kind of want to blend them, or I want to combine them for you. So I'm going to be reading a few passages, mainly from a few other astrologers, ancient astrologers, and we're just going to kind of be getting their interpretation on them. The way I love to read ancient texts is I love to see what the ancient astrologers say. I love to read it aloud, hear their opinions, hear their thoughts, and then kind of go in and see where I disagree and kind of argue and do some intertextuality with them, even though I don't have any text. I'm not a text that is writing, but I'm a living text. So I want to first pull up Abu Mashar. And there's this book that Abu Mashar has. It's called Abu Mashar's Flowers, which I think is also really kind of a sweet title. But Abu Mashar's Flowers, basically, it's a book on mundane astrology. And so in this book, he's going over through different interpretations and talks on kind of how you can interpret things in the mundane. And so in book 2, from lines 6 and then 12 through 13 in Ben Dyke's translation, one of the interpretations that Abu Mashar gives of Saturn, particularly in the watery signs, it says it signifies impediments in the riverside and seas by shipwreck, and animals of the water will suffer. In lines 12, he says, and if Saturn was in the watery ones, there will be impediment in waters, against shipwrecks, and the overturning of boats on the sea, in which foreign travelers will be imperiled in the water, and animals of the water will die. If it was a fortune instead of a bad one, turn your statement around and say good instead of evil. Instead of fear, say safety. There we go. And then further in book 4 of Abu Mashar's Flowers, he goes on to actually specify for Saturn and Pisces in particular. If Saturn and Pisces were in his northern latitude, it signifies much blowing of the northern winds and severity of the winter. If southern, it indicates destruction of the ships at sea and the occurrence of impediment in those things which operate in the waters. If it is eastern, so it is rising in a morning star, it indicates back and forth killing amongst the wealthy. If it is western, it indicates dejection of the nobles and the exaltation of the ignoble. If it is retrograde, it indicates the death of the religious and those worshiping God. There's a specific element towards Christianity here. And if it's direct, it indicates the populating of the houses of religion and the care of what is divine. I think there's a really interesting connotation here. Again, we see these ideas of ships and sea and water being associated with Saturn. We specifically see these more negative connotations, and again, this is because Saturn is a malefic, so we see challenges with water. And this is one thing you can interpret with the malefics as well, too, is as the malefics move through the elements, whether they're moving through water, whether they're moving through fire, whether they're moving through air, we see that there's extremity within those elements. So if we see with water, we see extreme circumstances within water in particular, or we see particularly shore sides and challenges along the coast is what we see, which I think is also interesting as we talk about climate change in Saturn and Pisces as well too. Also, again, this connotation back to those who are worshiping God, those who are religious. We see that connection to Jupiter ruling Pisces as well too. And again, we see the death of those who are religious with Saturn being retrograde as an affliction of Saturn, whereas direct those who are worshiping God or those who are worshiping in places of worship. It's also interesting too because I did bring this up as well too. Just because this is also something that the ancient astrologers will mention about the water signs in general. But I brought this up just because Al-Rajal in the Book of the Skills, in particularly Book 8, from lines 26 to 30 in Ben Dyke's translation, Al-Rajal is talking about if the Saturn and the North Node met in the same sign. And I want to talk about this because actually we can kind of segue into a transition, the transition into actually building a timeline of Saturn and Pisces. I will bring this up because Saturn actually will conjoin the North Node in Pisces towards the end of the transit. But what he says about this transit is that know that if the head and Saturn met in a sign, then they indicate harm and evil in accordance with the sign in which they are meeting. And if it was in the watery ones, it indicates the corruption of waters and the death of their animals, and the abundance of locusts and vermin and pains and phlegm. This is the one thing about locusts in particular is something they have the ancient astrologers seem to have this anxiety with bugs around the water signs, and so Saturn kind of indicates, I guess, this abundance of bugs, and I guess it would in turn indicate the abundance of fear of these bugs because Saturn does tend to get these indications of fear. So, okay, let's see. And so I guess that's all I have to kind of bring up from what some of the ancient authors said. I don't want to dwell in too much, but I informally consider myself a student of Abu Mashar because I always reference their work constantly. But I do want to start building a timeline now for Saturn and Pisces. So we're going to start throwing out some important dates here of some important, just some kind of transits Saturn is going to go through. So I'm going to start off with 2020. Our first one is actually on Sunday at 12:07 a.m. Eastern Time. Saturn will officially station direct at 18 degrees of Aquarius. Like I said, moving forward until then, Saturn will then come to conjoin the Sun. It is worth noting, though, that on February 16th, 2023, Saturn will conjoin the Sun. However, that will be at 27 degrees of Aquarius. So we do get this final cazimi in Aquarius. Saturn will not conjoin the Sun in Pisces for that year. We will get that official conjunction in 2024. I think it's really interesting what kind of happens in 2023, specifically with Saturn, because it's just around or just before February 6th, 2023, that Saturn finally sets under the beams of the Sun. And it sets under the beams in Aquarius, and then it conjoins the Sun in Aquarius. And then by February 26th, Saturn is starting to emerge out of the beam. Saturn will be officially 9 degrees away from the Sun by February 26th. But moving forward, it's not going to be super visible. But by the time it kind of emerges from those beams and it now is visible, by March 7th, 2023, Saturn will officially enter Pisces. This is going to be big for many reasons. Again, we'll talk about it in a moment. We're going to go over interpretation in the compare and contrast section. But Saturn will officially enter Pisces in March 2023. Some things to kind of note about that. Saturn is no longer self-autonomous. So if Saturn wants to enforce restriction, enforce limits, enforce boundaries, enforce slowness, it's going to now have to respond to Jupiter, and it's going to have to kind of ask Jupiter for that. And typically Saturn has no problem saying no and has no problem denying or rejecting things, but now it's going to be in the state of contention where its ruler is typically saying yes or typically affirming things. So it'll be interesting. It's going to be responding to Jupiter in Aries, though, in particular, and I've always found this fascinating as I've been doing my research on Saturn and Pisces, because this first kind of run of Saturn and Pisces is going to be Saturn responding to a planet that is in the sign that it's fallen in. So Saturn is fallen in the sign of Aries, and Jupiter is currently going to be there. So Saturn will be responding to a planet from a sign and the qualities of which it does not like. So we'll talk about that in a moment. Saturn will officially enter a water sign, so it'll move away from the air, and it'll go from a fixed sign, which is enduring and stable and represents the middle part of the season. So Aquarius, in this case, represents the middle of winter. It goes into a mutable sign, which represents the change into the next season or the transition from seasons. And this actually happens on the night of a very eventful full moon in Virgo, which is going to be opposing Saturn directly. So we are getting a full illumination of Saturn and Pisces right off the bat. This will happen. This is pretty much happening throughout most of Pisces season. Mercury will be in Pisces for most of March. But I really want to kind of jump to May 16th, 2023. This is going to be when Jupiter enters Taurus. This will be important for many reasons, because 2023 is going to really kick off things with the Saturn-Jupiter cycle. Again, we'll talk about that in a moment. It's going to kick off things with the Saturn-Jupiter cycle, but this will actually be, it's not going to be the first time Saturn will be able to witness Jupiter, but because Saturn can technically witness Jupiter right now, but they're not in aspect with each other. But it's going to be important. Jupiter is going to be changing signs. Anytime Jupiter changes signs, it's going to impact something going on with Saturn and kind of the themes and topics Saturn is going to bring up. So that happens on May 16th, 2023. And then on June 17th, we're going to have Saturn station retrograde at 7 degrees of Pisces. So this is the furthest Saturn is getting in 2023, 7 Pisces. And so this is actually a good moment to talk about if you have your natal Saturn in the mutable signs at Gemini, Sagittarius, Pisces, or Virgo, and specifically if you have Saturn in Pisces, your Saturn return will go exact in 2023 if you have it from 0 to 7 degrees. And either your Saturn opposition will go exact if you have Saturn from 0 to 7 Virgo. And if you have Saturn from 0 to 7 Pisces, or not Pisces, Gemini or Sagittarius, your Saturn square will start to come towards its peak in 2023. So it's on June 17th, Saturn stations retrograde, and then it's on June 19th that Jupiter will officially make its first and only sextile to Saturn in Pisces. So we only get a one and done sextile of Jupiter and Saturn during that time. And then it's on July 20th that we're going to have Mars in Virgo oppose Saturn in Pisces. So the Mars-Saturn cycle that actually began earlier this year on April 4th when Mars and Saturn conjoined at 22 Aquarius. They just recently had their square over the summer in Taurus Aquarius. And then moving forward, the opposition is actually going to take place in Virgo Pisces. So we're seeing this shift of the Saturn-Mars cycle go into the mutable signs. It's by the end of the year on November 4th, 2023, that Saturn will finally station direct. And then it's towards the end of that month on November 25th, 2023, that Mars in Sagittarius will square Saturn at 0 degrees of Pisces. So Saturn is going to kind of do a little bit of a teaser and kind of act like it's going to go back into Aquarius, but it's really not. It's going to literally get to 0 degrees in 30 minutes of Pisces when it stations direct on November 4th. So it's literally getting to that 0 degree mark. And then when Mars kind of comes right into Sagittarius, it boom, just square Saturn right there. And so 2023 is kind of important. I really think the action of Saturn in Pisces really comes in 2024, 2025. 2024, Saturn, on February 28th, 2024, Saturn will conjoin the Sun again at 9 degrees of Pisces. So this will be our first Cazimi in the sign of Pisces. And then on April 10th, 2024, we'll have the Mars-Saturn conjunction at 14 degrees of Pisces, which, of course, has to be the height of my Saturn square. The gods were just like, here's the malefics. Always. But then on May 25th, 2024, we're going to have Jupiter entering the sign of Gemini, and this is going to be really interesting too, for kind of opening up 2024 into 2025 and what that's going to look like. So yeah, May 25th, 2024, and then it's on June 29th, 2024, Saturn will station retrograde at 19 degrees of Pisces. So the furthest in 2024 Saturn's going to get is into 19 degrees of Pisces, just barely touching, just barely crossing that second decan into the third decan line. And then, let's see, it's on August 16th then, we're actually going to have Mars in Gemini make a square to Saturn in Pisces. And I think this is actually going to be really interesting because Mars is currently in Gemini. So this is the next time Mars is in Gemini, making that square to Saturn. Which will be really interesting to kind of think of, again, how... I'm going to talk about that in a moment, but it's going to be really interesting to think about how this Mars retrograde in Gemini is... eventually Saturn is going to need to put some restraint on Mars going through the sign in terms of news, lies, information, deceit of accuracy and facts of information, which is what Mars in Gemini has definitely been bringing up. But it'll be on August 16th that Mars squares Saturn. And then it'll be on August 19th that Jupiter in Gemini will make a square to Saturn retrograde. And so this opens up a really big part of the Saturn-Jupiter cycle. And so this is really also what kind of Saturn in Pisces is going to be about. We're really going to start to see the beginnings and the seeds that were planted on December 21st, 2020, when Jupiter conjoined Saturn in Aquarius for their their 20-year cycle that they do. They can join every 20 years. And so typically the ancient astrologers, when they looked at these Saturn-Jupiter conjunctions, they were indicative of the rise and the fall of dynasties, changes in political parties and factions, and the kind of associations that people had in government and things of that nature. Saturn is this kind of older generation, and Jupiter is the newer generation who kind of comes in and expands and kind of takes over in this case. So the Saturn-Jupiter cycles are definitely associated with major political moments of change in mundane astrology. And they're also used to mark major moments in history and with religion as well, too. And so it's really interesting how 2023, we start to see the opening and the beginning of the things that were started in 2020 actually start to kind of come up. And these major changes within political parties and changes within all over the world, really. We really start to see this develop and come into focus in 2023, but we really see the tension start to form in 2024 when Jupiter in Gemini squares Saturn in Aquarius. Saturn, oh my God. It's force of habit saying Saturn in Aquarius, but Saturn in Pisces. And then it's by December 24th of 2024 that, so the first square between Saturn and Jupiter, there's going to be 3 of them. There's going to be 2 in Gemini Pisces. The first one is going to be while Jupiter is direct, and then Saturn will be retrograde. So this first one will happen at 17 Gemini Pisces. And then on December 24th, 2024, Jupiter will then be retrograde, but it'll square Saturn, who is now stationed direct at 14 Pisces. So definitely that activation is going to be very important during that time. I'm pretty sure, I don't think I got to Saturn stationing direct in 2024, but in 2024, Saturn will station direct on November 15th. And it'll station direct at 12 Pisces. So if you have if you have Saturn in Pisces from 12 to 19 degrees, you're going to have kind of a little bit of an extended Saturn return. Again, we're going to talk about the Saturn return moment in a moment for you Saturn and Pisces people. But then we have, so I mean, those are actually some of the more highlights of 2024. But 2025, again, major action. It's on January 18th, 2025, that Venus will conjoin Saturn in Pisces. So this will be the first out of 3 conjunctions Venus will make to Saturn in Pisces. And then it's on March 12th, 2025, that Saturn will conjoin the Sun in Pisces. So we'll have our second Cazimi in Pisces. I think it'll be our last Cazimi in Pisces, too. I don't think we'll actually have another one after that in Pisces, because the next one should be in Aries after that in 2026. But then it's on April 7th, 2025, that Venus will be retrograde. So there is a pretty big Venus retrograde coming in 2025, and it'll actually conjoin Saturn at 25 degrees of Pisces on April 7th. And then it's again after Venus stations direct on April 24th, towards the end of the month, that Venus will conjoin it for the final time at 27 Pisces. It'll be on May 24th, 2025, that Saturn will enter Aries. And then Saturn will stay there up until September 1st, 2025. It'll retrograde back into Pisces, and then it'll come back into Aries officially and leave Pisces by February 13th, 2026. So if we're really forming a timeline of the entirety of this Saturn and Pisces transit, March 7th, 2023 to February 13th, 2026 are your ranges of this transit. In 2026, though, because I did skip over some stuff here, on June 15th, 2025, Jupiter in Cancer makes a square to Saturn in Aries. So this kind of finishes up the previous 2 squares that Saturn and Jupiter made in Gemini and Pisces. And then it'll be by July 13th, 2025, that Saturn will station retrograde at 1 degree and 56 minutes of Aries. So really like 2 degrees of Aries. That's the furthest Saturn will get in 2025. And then it'll be on August 8th that Mars in Libra will then oppose Saturn retrograde in Aries. So the Mars-Saturn cycle that was started in 2024, we see that climax actually start to come in 2025 here. But it doesn't take place in Libra, in Virgo Pisces. It takes place in Libra Aries, as Saturn will go retrograde. Saturn will eventually go back into Pisces. And then Saturn will station on September 1st. And then on November 27th, Saturn will station direct at 25 Pisces. And then it'll be by December 8th, 2025, that Mars in Sagittarius will make a square to Saturn in Pisces. And then again, by the end of that, the last transit will have the Saturn going into Aries. And so that is kind of a very rough overview of what to expect with like kind of some of these major transits that are happening with Saturn and Pisces. Again, the main things are the opening of the Saturn and Jupiter cycle kind of going on here. Some of the major things that are also happening as well too is the Saturn-Neptune conjunction in 2025 as well too. Saturn and Neptune, they have not conjoined for like a long time. I think it's been like 30 years. It might be a little bit more than 30 years, but Saturn and Jupiter, they run on a much Saturn and Neptune, they run on a much larger cycle. And I think a big part of this transit, when we actually start to get into the interpretation of this transit, is we do have to talk about Neptune. I am a person, and so the way I think about outers in the astrology is that the outer planets, the outers. I don't like the outers as experiences. I think they are all malefic, and I think they all really do not give a fuck about us. The fact that we can't see them and we cannot actually, visibly connect with them in the sky, it makes them a little bit less sympathetic towards us as mortals. And so when I think about Neptune, and I think about Neptune moving through Pisces, Neptune originally came here in 2011, and really officially solidified its ingress by 2012. And so if you think about the house that Pisces rules in your chart, Neptune will tend to bring confusion. Sometimes it can bring some illusion. Sometimes it can bring this idea of your perspective of things being either distorted or kind of fuzzy. Neptune, typically there's this idea, I guess, of rose-colored glasses, but the fog association with Neptune is one thing I really like. And especially like this idea of the way that water is able to kind of distort our perspective or distort the perspective of light as it passes even through the ocean. Neptune does not make things clear. And I think this is going to be a very interesting part of this transit because as Saturn is coming through Pisces, it's almost like Saturn, this planet of grounding, realism, and reality, is coming to kind of clear up a lot of the misinformation or the misunderstandings that Neptune has, and the fog that Neptune has kind of created here in the sign of Pisces, whether that be around the idea of beauty, around the idea of glamour, around the idea of spirituality, whether that be around the idea of religion. All of these things have been very important within society, within the astrological community, within politics. We see all of these things being really relevant. And I think Saturn coming into Pisces, I personally see this as a moment where a lot of these confusions or even delusion around religion, around faith, around belief, we start to see Saturn bringing a lot more grounding or a lot more crystallizing of what is actually real versus what is actually not real, what is an illusion and what is too good to be true versus what is actually, real. And so that'll be the first thing we're kind of dealing with. But in terms of going into comparison and contrast, that's the next section I want to kind of go into to kind of talk about, build off of our timeline. But just give me a moment. I do need to take my water. Also, I do want to give a huge shout out to everyone that is in here today. We have 106 people in the talk today. Thank you all for coming. Thank you all. It means the world to me. You would come to hear me talk. I'm so excited to now actually get into interpretation because I love setting up timelines. I love kind of, conceptualizing where things are going. Dates are always important to me. The Virgo in me is popping out all the time. But let's actually talk about the elements first. And I kind of briefly touched on this with air and water, that they do share similar qualities. They share this wetness as their shared quality. However, air contains heat and it's expansive and it's open, whereas water contains coldness. So it's a lot more consolidating, condensing, and it's a lot more introverted as well too, or it envelops or it encompasses things that or it absorbs things that that are brought into its body. But due to both of the moisture of these kind of elements, there is this kind of adaptable and flexible nature that we see with both of these elements. We see less of this with Aquarius, truthfully, because Aquarius is a fixed sign. So we're seeing this rigidity of air, which is the fixing of ideas, the fixing of social values and structures in society. And I think one of the big things I do want to talk about Saturn even being in an air sign over the past 2.5 years is really, think about air as a planet. It is this planet of connection, or not planet, oh my god, as this element. It is this planet of connection. Oh my god, why do I keep saying planet? It is this element of connection. It talks about communication. It talks about the way people interact or the way people form community or form conversations. If you think about sound, for example, sound has to travel through air in order, for us to communicate with each other. But one of the big things that I think is really interesting about Saturn and Aquarius as well, too, is that there is this idea of isolation that ultimately comes up with Aquarius. And I think that's one of the biggest things we've seen. If we go back to March 2020, March 2020 is an unforgettable moment in probably history, honestly. And I think a lot of this is attributed to Saturn's ingress here. We see Saturn being this planet of restriction, of boundaries, creating more limits, more no's, and more distance between social interactions and social connections as it is in the sign of Aquarius. And there has been this very distant feeling of either building community or building friendship or building, people to connect with as long as Saturn has kind of been here. Saturn can bring these kind of obstacles or challenges within the ability to relate or connect to each other because there is such a strong, obstacles or boundaries that prevent us from doing that. Those things, again, are going to be kind of interpreted in a moment. But I think it's also interesting, too, Saturn in Aquarius. Aquarius gets this connotations of old rulers as well, too, and people, like we said earlier, people who are old. So we see older people coming into power. But I've also really, keeping up with at least U.S. politics and everything like that. Most of our Congress is, I forgot what the median age of Congress, but I think it's like 58. And I'm like, how is the median age of everyone, or I think it's the mean age of people in Congress, how is the mean age of everyone in Congress people who are at their second Saturn return? Not first, second. this is a form of Saturn Aquarius, old rulers. And so it's really interesting too, because Saturn being in the fixed sign, this is kind of what I want to go into next, is the change of Saturn going from fixed to mutable. We see Saturn being much more enduring, but also talking about enduring power, enduring social conventions as well too. We see Saturn, especially in Aquarius. I think one of the biggest things, especially about Saturn and Aquarius, again, it's this disconnect, and it is this. A lot of times, it can also be the rigidity in our ideas, or the the rigidity in our ideas and the rigidity in our way of thinking, because Saturn is typically wanting to preserve knowledge and to preserve tradition, but sometimes it's not always the best. I think one of the big things that, especially, I know Dr. Olomi talks about this a lot on his Aquarius episode, but this idea of conformity, especially with Aquarius as well too, conformity to standards, conformity to the rules of society, to bending to these. Saturn only favors those who conform to its limits. And I think that's a very important thing to kind of discuss. And actually, I also think this is going to be something we discuss with Saturn and Mars as well, too, is Mars kind of shaking Saturn's foundations or shaking Saturn's boundaries. We've definitely seen that kind of take place as well over the past, actually, even the past Mars-Saturn conjunctions. The most recent one, actually, the Mars-Saturn conjunction that happened on April 4th, I often have now, the way I'm actually like starting to look at these now is that it is the shaking of those who are fixed and enduring in power in particular. And so Saturn kind of being actually quite literally, and I think this is important to kind of talk about Saturn conjoining Mars in this sign, in this fixed sign, is shaking the foundations of those who are old and enduring in their power and in their rule, pretty much. And so it's really interesting as we see then, this kind of cycle, I guess, play out with Mars and Saturn, because now Saturn is going to go into a mutable sign. And so this kind of power that Saturn has, this power to be able to enforce rules, to enforce restrictions, to enforce restraints, Saturn, it's almost as if Saturn's structure kind of dissolves or is kind of loosened as it goes into Pisces. There's a lot more inconsistency, or there's a lot more changeability. And I think one of the things that we're going to see a lot more with Saturn and Pisces is this idea of, I guess, things being less fixed or less enduring or less long or less dragging out in terms of maybe whether it be challenges or conflict. But now we see a lot more inconsistency, and we see a lot more mutability. I think of Saturn as a planet of structure, and it is a planet of, again, stability, but also, with any building, with any house, with any foundation, you need a solid structure. You need a solid foundation. But Saturn shows where those foundations are changeable or liable to some fluctuation, as the mutable signs represent the transition from one season to the next. So if we think about Pisces, for example, this is the end of winter and the transition into spring. And I think this is really interesting too, what in the cycle of Saturn, what Pisces kind of plays a role in doing here. Because if we think about the past really 5 years, since 2017, Saturn has been in its home sign. And now Saturn leaving its home sign, going into the sign of Pisces, where it's going to start kind of, I don't want to say, I almost kind of think of this Saturn and Pisces as the process of structures in society starting to wither away. And the reason why I say wither away, and I want to emphasize on starting to wither away, is because it's almost like Saturn and Pisces is kind of introducing these changes in structure and these changes in whether it be government, whether it be law, whether it be in the way society is organized, to eventual dismantling of these structures once Saturn comes into Aries. One of the big parts about Pisces is that as an immutable sign, it carries this cold nature of the winter, but it also carries this warm nature of the spring as well too. And Saturn is said to be really fallen in the sign of Aries. This is the sign where Saturn doesn't like to be in. And I think it's really interesting here too, because Saturn is this planet that typically gets associated with extreme cold. So Saturn naturally gets these winter signs of Capricorn and Aquarius, especially Aquarius, because, and this is also, again, really interesting. Capricorn is the beginning of winter, but the same way the sun's strength is the most prominent during Leo season, during the height of the summer, Saturn's prominence is much more stronger and much more cold during the height of the winter. And so this is now where we start to see Saturn warming up. we start to see Saturn actually loosening up a bit. Those restrictions, those delays. Saturn doesn't have much more strength to actually enforce those things as much as it was able to in Aquarius, or keep its power, or keep those rules, or enforce those boundaries here. And there is an element of bendability and adaptability that is going to be required over the next 2.5 years in general. I think of very much, one of the things that kind of comes to mind of Saturn and Pisces to me is this idea of buildings, and this idea of, I mean, you could also, I mean, this is also even something you could see with Saturn and Aquarius, but I think in general, Saturn and the mutable signs, it's this idea of structure needing to have some sort of bendability or some sort of flexibility. In the instance of skyscrapers, for example, if you have really tall skyscrapers, they need to be built with some element to account for the wind. They need to be built with some element to account for the sway of the earth. You know what I mean? Like these buildings. I mean, I don't know if anyone's been in tall buildings. I'm from New York, so I've had my fair share of being in buildings. But when you see them move and you see them wobble, it's like kind of weird. You're like, that is a huge ass structure that is literally just kind of swaying back and forth. And, part of that bendability and part of that flexibility is needed to actually retain structure and to retain some sort of stability. So it's going to be interesting to kind of think about that as Saturn does go into this mutable sign. And I think it's also important too, because Saturn is going from, again, the solid and fixed and stable, staying in power, being thorough, and carrying something to completion in Aquarius, where now it's fluctuating. So it's going to be interesting. I think also another interesting part of Saturn being in the sign is, again, the sign dignity. It goes from the sign of its domicile to actually really going to a sign it doesn't have much dignity in. And so I'm when I think of a planet that it's in its said to be peregrine. So when Saturn going from its domicile, Saturn going from a place of home, Saturn going from a place where it has access to resources to bring about the things that it represents, Saturn is now going into a place of inconsistency. And so I definitely think that a planet in peregrine, it also is said to kind of be wandering. A planet is said to be kind of like a traveler here, and just kind of passing through. And so Saturn is kind of passing through here. But again, Saturn is highlighting that there is some much, I guess, larger challenge that needs to be examined or looked at, especially because it's going to be here with Neptune. And I mean, also the North Node will cross Neptune in 2024, eventually to 2025. Oh gosh, North Node, Neptune, not ready for that shit. However, Saturn going from this domicile, it has the ability to bring about restraint, to bring conformity, to bring installations, and to bring the fixing of ideas or values. And then going to this position of losing dignity, it's almost about losing this coldness. And I think the element that the role that Saturn plays in its coldness is that the coldness keeps things together. Think about ice. The coldness keeps that water together. It consolidates it. It condenses it. We're seeing that. We're almost kind of seeing in Pisces season, and this is also a good analogy for Pisces season too. The ice starts to melt. And again, I think a lot of this is going to be either structures dissolving, structures are loosened, or what it was consolidated together starts to fall apart. And so whether it be the way people are grouped together in society, the way society is organized, I think one of the very interesting things that's going to be highlighted, especially in 2023, in that first decan of Pisces, if you're familiar with tarot, that first decan of Pisces is the Eight of Cups. And the image of the Eight of Cups is literally someone leaving behind these 8 cups and kind of setting out and leaving. And I think it's really interesting as Saturn gets ready to leave its home sign, kind of what symbolism that brings. And I also think it's, again, too, it's going to be it's going from the self-autonomous, constrictive, boundary enforcing regulator, slowing things down and creating obstacles where now Saturn has to kind of respond to Jupiter, as I said earlier, and has to kind of ask Jupiter, hey, can we tell people no? Can we, ground people's faith and ground people's idea and of, spirituality, of religion, of community, of all of those things? And Jupiter, where Saturn wants to create restrictions, Jupiter's like, no restrictions. Like we should be open. We should be affirming. This is kind of the contrast between Saturn and Jupiter. And Saturn is really entering into some kind of kind of contradictory territory because, again, Saturn says no, whereas Jupiter is going to tell you yes. Saturn is going to reject you, whereas Jupiter is going to affirm you. And so Saturn is kind of dealing, again, in this state of contention where it wants to restrict, but it's also dealing with this idea of constant affirmation of some sort of ideal or some sort of belief. I also do want to talk about the sign relationships that Saturn is going to be, the kind of the signs that Saturn will be aspecting. And so which signs are going to be getting some, basically which sign Saturn's at is going to, oh my God, I can't string words together right now. Which sign Saturn, who is going to have their ass beat by Saturn, basically, is kind of what I'm trying to articulate. No, but seriously though. When Saturn goes into Pisces, the two signs that it's going to sextile are both Capricorn and Taurus. So Saturn will be trying to help out both Capricorn and Taurus. For those who have Saturn in Capricorn, this will be the opening or the beginning of this new Saturn cycle for you, since Saturn will sextile your natal Saturn. Whereas if you have Saturn in Taurus, this will be the closing of the previous 30 years of your life, or what should be maybe like 25 years of your life by this point. Saturn will make a square to Gemini. It'll make the overcoming square to Gemini. So Saturn will be putting a lot of restrictions, and Gemini will be the sign that probably bears the brunt of this, these new restrictions or these new changes in structure that Saturn will be bringing. It'll also make a square to Sagittarius as well too. So there also is this contention where Sagittarius will be experiencing those changes as well too. Saturn is going to oppose Virgo, but it's going to be contending and challenging a lot with Virgo. We're also seeing Saturn going to make a trine to both Cancer and to Scorpio. So Saturn will be able to offer some sort of discipline. Saturn will be able to offer depth of knowledge. Saturn will be able to offer a little bit more slowness and a little bit more of a smoother stop, if that makes sense. I see Saturn in these sextiles and in these trines. I mean, this is what Abu Mashar says. Saturn in the sextile and the trines, it gives its gifts. So Saturn is able to give the virtue of the depth of knowledge, the wisdom to the Capricorns, to the Scorpios, to the Tauruses, and to the Cancers as well, too. However, unfortunately, the mutable signs are going to be in for some growing pains, as I like to call them. And this is actually kind of what I want to now talk about in terms of, Saturn, and Saturn kind of giving growing pains, I guess. I do want to talk about Saturn in Pisces really quickly, though, for the Saturn return people. Because, this Saturn return is, for those born 1994 to 1996, this will be your first Saturn return. We also have those born, I think it's 1964 to 1966. Those will be your second Saturn return, so those turning 58 or those turning 58 to 60. And I think this is a kind of a good moment to talk about what the Saturn return, really is. Like, kind of demystify a little bit of this kind of transit and, what to expect from it. Oh, but actually, I did want to. Actually, should I go into that first? Yeah, I think I'll actually go into it first because I will talk about other things along the way. But so the Saturn return, to kind of define what the Saturn return is, and what it is as an experience. It is the moment that Saturn will enter the same sign as the sign that Saturn is in your natal chart. So if you have Saturn in Pisces, your Saturn return will officially begin on March 7th, 2023, but it won't be over until February 13th, 2026. And so the full length of the transit happens when Saturn enters the sign versus when it leaves. But there is this climactic moment of when Saturn gets to the degree of your natal Saturn, when the transit of the Saturn return will go exact. And so typically this can happen around your 29th year of life. It should be your 30th year of life, but that'll be age 29. And so the Saturn return is a really important time because this is actually when the minor period of Saturn gets activated. And so for those who are unfamiliar with the minor years of the planets, the minor years of the planets are a technique that is used by some ancient Hellenistic astrologers, such as Valians, oh my god, such as Valens, such as Firmicus. There are these values and these numbers that are associated with all the planets, but also all the zodiac signs, because the planets rule those zodiac signs too, but primarily the planets. And their numbers derive from the amount of synodic cycles that take place within, how long it takes for a full how do I describe that? The amount of sidereal periods it takes for the synodic cycle, I guess, to complete. But generally, for all the planets, just kind of for reference, for Saturn, that's going to take 30 years. For Jupiter, that will take 12 years. For Mars, 15 years. For the Sun, 19 years. For Venus, 8 years. For Mercury, 20 years. And then for the Moon, 25 years. And so the minor years of the planets is important because for the ancient astrologers, it was seen to be this activation of when these things in your natal chart are actually going to come about and be signified in your chart. And so it's really important because when you kind of take these numbers of the minor years of the planets, you can kind of divvy them up if you want to as well too. So you can get like 2/3 periods, you can get half a period, you can get all these different types of periods of the minor years. It just so happens, in fact, I do have the minor years of Saturn kind of pulled up in those little divvies, but you could also do the math on your own as well too if you feel so inclined. But in terms of Saturn, its quote unquote fourths in years are at 7.5, so when the first Saturn square happens. But then we have that kind of double in years that happens. So we have 30 when its first activation happens, 60 when its next activation happens. Half of its years are at 15, and then a third of its years happen at 12. And then, yeah, I think that was it. Yeah, so there's a few different times that Saturn can get activated based on the minor years. I know some people also do 2/3 as well too. I don't think I have those actually listed. Yeah, I don't have those listed completely right here. But that Saturn, that year when you turn 29, though, is really important because when we're looking at the minor years of the planets, the ancient Greek astrologers, they did not have zero. So we're using ordinal numbers here. So whereas this indicates 30 years of time that has elapsed of a full Saturn cycle, this will technically be age 29 for you. And so somewhere between age 29 to age 30 is around the time the Saturn return should go exact. Again, generally depending on your chart, depending on where Saturn is, all of those other things, those are going to kind of characterize when it goes exact. But depending on the house that Saturn is in, this is when we start to see these activations kind of come up. And so this Saturn return experience, a lot of the time, I've been consulting with a lot of with astrologers, but also a lot of clients as well too, and helping them through their Saturn returns. And there seems to be this idea that Saturn is going to be this big bad bully that is going to absolutely destroy your life at 30. And I think Saturn can definitely bring some hardship, but I think it is much more reflective of that individual who thinks they are worthy of suffering, maybe consciously or unconsciously, than the actual transit of Saturn itself. And so when we think about this Saturn return period, Saturn is this planet of seriousness, and it brings with it a more somber tone to the house that it represents. So if you have Saturn in Pisces, Saturn will be revisiting this house in your chart. But generally, take a look at where Pisces is in your chart, because Saturn will bring a much more serious and slow down the experience of those house topics as well, too. That's one of the big things that Saturn does. But Saturn tends to want to... I think I usually see this moment for the Saturn return for clients is that it's this moment where they are able to step into a position of authority and a position of agency to actually enforce some sort of structure, some sort of boundary, or some sort of or uphold some sort of responsibility in regards to the house that Saturn will be having its return in. And so this also can kind of apply for some of the other hard aspects of Saturn as well too, is that the Pisces house in your chart is going to generally indicate where there is more responsibility, there's more effort, there's more labor that is needed. The goal with Saturn, though, is not necessarily for you to suffer, but is for you to have things that are lasting and enduring. And so sometimes that might come with a little bit of emotional discomfort. Saturn is not an easy planet, and I'm not gonna try to act like Saturn is an easy planet by any means. Definitely has not been in my experience. However, Saturn, like all of the other planets, you have the agency to work with. And it is at that Saturn return that you start to develop your agency to work with Saturn. And one of the important things to consider about the Saturn return as well, too, is in the previous 30 years of your life, you were pretty much just a child. You know what I mean? So Saturn in those 30 years is kind of highlighting the existing structures and the existing sense of stability within these houses, for better or for worse. And it is at this moment of the Saturn return that you are kind of able to, again, like I said, step into that position to take responsibility and to take some sort of authority. But it's just more than that too, because moving forward, even after the Saturn return as well too, Saturn will now be moving over the same parts of the zodiac as it was when you were a child. So in many ways, the Saturn return is almost kind of like revisiting childhood as well too, revisiting the ways you've been conditioned socially, revisiting the blockages, the limits, the restrictions that have kind of been placed upon you in that house. Whatever house Saturn will usually be in will indicate where things take a little bit more time to develop, or there's a little bit more of a late blooming with those house topics. So if it's in the first, Saturn can sometimes bring a little bit more late blooming in terms of the sense of self of an identity. If it's in the fourth, it's with family. If it's in the seventh, it's going to be with your relationships and your partnerships. If it's in the 10th, it's going to talk about your career. But one of the big things I do also want to mention about Saturn, and we kind of briefly touched on this earlier, is that Saturn obscures things. Saturn hides things. Saturn makes things hidden. And so it is almost kind of in the Saturn return moment that you are becoming aware of the things that you have been previously ignorant to, whether that is maliciously or whether that be actually, just you don't know what you don't know. Saturn kind of gives you this opportunity to really deepen your knowledge. And this is ultimately one way to best work with Saturn if you are having challenges with Saturn. Saturn will always reward those who look beneath the surface, and also those who do the research. And also, I think like one of the big things of Saturn is because it represents old things, it represents ancient things, kind of doing veneration for the past, for history, for old people, for ancestors. These are all ways you can actually honor Saturn. Honoring your ancestors, not necessarily, and there's a big difference between honor and, do I want to use this word? Do I want to say the sentence? I guess what I want to say is there's a big difference between honor and praise. You don't necessarily have to praise your ancestors, because there are people in our lineage that can do fucked up things depending on what it is, depending on everyone's family history. But you do have to acknowledge the things that have happened. You know what I mean? You can't just ignore them. The more you try to ignore things with Saturn, this is where you're going to start running into issues. Saturn does not favor ignorance. It can represent ignorance, but it does not favor it. A big thing about Saturn, too, is that it also represents a lot more discipline as well, too. Self-discipline in particular. This is also why we see the sun is depressed in the sign of Libra and also is exiled in the sign of Aquarius. These are two signs that Saturn loves to be in. Saturn loves restraint. Saturn loves deliberation. Saturn loves contemplation. Saturn loves thinking before acting. And this is why also Mars is exalted in Capricorn as well, too. The impulsivity, the urgency, the quickness of Mars is tempered by the slowness of Saturn. And so it's really at this Saturn return moment that we're able to see the, oh my God, what was I just talking about? Well, it's at the Saturn return moment that we're really able to see, I guess, the ability to kind of not, I guess, have more self-discipline in this area of life, but there's more of you are able to start developing a better relationship with this because you're more aware of the hidden understandings or inner workings of that relationship with those house topics in your life. And I think the biggest thing about Saturn too as a planet is that it crystallizes things, whether that be quite literally making things hard and making them rigid and making them, again, permanent, or whether that be crystallizing a sense of understanding as well too. And so again, this is a moment to kind of take responsibility, but also crystallize your understanding of that house. I mean, that house becomes really important in your life. I mean, it's that Saturn return moment is a moment where you are really where that Saturn and the things that it represents in your chart are all able to become activated. And again, if you have, and this is a big way to kind of, I guess, discern whether your Saturn return is going to be a little bit more challenging or a little bit more positive. If you're born during the daytime, congrats, Saturn loves you. Caveat with that, though. If you're born during the daytime and your sun is in the same hemisphere as Saturn, Saturn loves you. If Saturn is unable to witness the rays of the sun, Saturn, so let's say we have someone who's a day chart, but Saturn is below the horizon and the sun is above the horizon. That Saturn's still going to be a malefic who's out of sect because it doesn't witness the rays of the sun to temper it and to add heat to the coldness, where Saturn will bring inhibition and restriction. The sun can offer a little bit of heat, and it can be a little bit necessary for Saturn. Balance is always necessary with anything. That's why Saturn exalts in Libra. But this activation of Saturn coming into Pisces as well too. I think especially for the Saturn and Pisces crew, a lot of this is going to be, I mean, I've been seeing a lot of weird fucking experiences of Saturn, of people who have had Neptune on their Saturn recently, like the Saturn and Pisces people, just making their sense of reality just very confusing right now. Their sense of being grounded too. Saturn is a very grounding planet. A lot of the Saturn Pisces people have just been going through this really weird muck of confusion and just not being able to see things clearly. Things being too blended together in Pisces. It's things coming together, again, as a whole. This is the thing between Pisces and Virgo. Things being separated and being discerned and categorized and compartmentalized in Virgo versus things being all-encompassing and all-inclusive in Pisces. And so a lot of, again, the Saturn and Pisces, I'm kind of looking forward to this for the Saturn and Pisces crew because I think it's going to be a much needed sense of grounding after this real inconsistency with structure, with stability, within the topics of the houses that Saturn rules and the house that it's located in the chart. Like I've seen a lot of the time, like Saturn ruling the fourth house or being in the fourth house for some of those Saturn and Pisces people, like Neptune kind of passing over that is like dealing like with issues of homelessness and dealing with issues of wandering as well too. Also, a big thing of Saturn of Pisces as a sign is that it indicates floundering or wandering as well too. And so I think Saturn is ultimately trying to bring more order. And again, Saturn is this planet of endurance. It's things that are fixed. It's things that are long lasting. And I think the question really is, during the Saturn and Pisces transit that's coming up, is sure, something can withstand the test of time, but it also needs to be flexible as well too. Again, going back to that building analogy. So the minor period of Saturn gets activated for those who are turning 29. And again, you do want to kind of examine interpreting your Saturn return. You do want to interpret whether you have a day or a night chart. That is going to color your experience of how you are naturally going to experience Saturn. Again, if you're born during the nighttime, and if you have the sun below the horizon and Saturn's above the horizon, Saturn is even more malefic. But if it's below the horizon and the sun is also below the horizon, and the sun is able to witness Saturn, then Saturn can kind of be tempered even in a night chart. But again, all of the sect considerations are really going to matter. And I do think that especially Saturn as the malefic out of sect, sometimes during your Saturn return, if you have Saturn as the malefic out of sect, it can talk about certain structures or things that are stable in your life, or quote unquote seemingly stable in your life, needing to be changed, needing to be turned around, something not being as enduring as you thought. Or there being this kind of excessive restriction or this excess of cold that kind of needs to be examined. So, I think usually that Saturn return can try to be this moment of balancing out that moment of balancing out that extreme nature of Saturn. But if you're having a Saturn return too, and you have like a day chart, your Saturn is pretty well dignified, even though Saturn's not in its domicile, like in Aquarius or Pisces. If Saturn is pretty dignified, Saturn return can go really great. Some people have had some really good come up stories during the Saturn return, where they're either, establishing themselves in their career, in their field of work. It's definitely a real sense of accomplishment. But there is this thing I do like to talk about with the Saturn return, where society, especially now, expects you to have all your shit together by 30. And even in your 20s, which I think is a completely unrealistic Saturn, when people who are in their 20s have not even had their birthday on Saturn. It is really this moment when you come into 30 that, one, you have this entrance into adulthood. You have this entrance into, one, realizing your body does not work the same as well, too. I mean, a big part of the Saturn return is the aging quality of it too. Um, Especially if it's in the sixth house or it rules the sixth house, issues with health definitely come up. In the first house, health can come up as well too. But this moment where the Saturn return happens, this is the moment where you are just setting down foundation for your life. It's not the moment where you are supposed to have everything accomplished by. This is the moment where the groundwork is beginning. You start to make decisions for yourself. You are a full ass 30-year-old. Who is going to tell you shit about what you can do with your life? That is the vibe of Saturn at the Saturn return. And I've also seen that a lot with all of my other colleagues and friends who are going through their Saturn return. Like, there is this sense of maturing that comes during this time, but it's the maturing that comes from the passing of time and the wisdom that comes with life experience. There's only some experiences that can be gained through living. We can talk about things and even talk about these transits as much as we want. We will not know completely how they will play out until we actually experience them. And I think that's one of the big things about Saturn as well too, is that it does tap into experience as well too. Saturn is talks about knowledge that is accumulated, knowledge and wisdom that is accumulated from experience. And that's why elders are signified by Saturn, because they have lots of experience. They have the multitude of knowledge. And they are also gateways and accesses to the traditions. It is through, and I do recommend this as well too, as a kind of Saturn return, not necessarily remediation, but as a way to kind of get a better understanding of what other people, what other people who have previously gone through the Saturn return have kind of experienced. You should take a look at what your fellow Saturn and Pisces people, if you know anyone who has Saturn and Pisces born between 1964 to 1966, ask them what their 30s were like. One of the best ways you can appease Saturn is going to elders for wisdom and for advice, because this is what we're here for. I mean, I'm saying we're here as if I am an elder, not far from it. But Saturn is in my first house, so there is a reverence that I have for old things or ancient things. And this is a moment to explore old and ancient things with the Saturn return as well, too. I do want to say, though, I don't want to spend too much time on Saturn and Pisces, but it is a moment definitely of kind of clearing or crystallizing your vision of how, again, you want to bring things about in the houses that it represents. So if Saturn's in the first house, this is a crystallizing of your sense of self, of your identity. I think it's actually really funny, a Saturn in the first house experience that has actually just recently happened. It's not a Saturn in Pisces necessarily, but Jeanette McCurdy, she just released her book, I'm Glad My Mother Died, and she actually is an Aquarius rising with Saturn in Aquarius on the ascendant. And so this whole idea of what I'm listening to her about her interviews, I want to read the book eventually because, I think Jeanette McCurdy is, I love the way she speaks. I love her eloquence, very much Saturn. But a lot of what she was talking about for, this book is that it was her kind of reclaiming the sense of self and identity that her mother has kind of projected onto her. So that Saturn in the first is really coming to terms with, okay, establishing a foundation of who am I, If it's in the second house, this is establishing the idea of livelihood, of money. Usually Saturn in the second house, by the way, money doesn't come until that Saturn return, but one of the powers of Saturn in the second house is that it's the ability to retain money. Sometimes if Saturn is a malefic out of sect here, though, it can be an indicator of poverty and challenges with scarcity and access to resources. And so that Saturn return can be this period of coming into trying to pull yourself out of that kind of cycle. Saturn in the third house definitely talks about community. It can also talk about establishing or crystallizing relationship with those around you, with siblings. Siblings also definitely important, but that can definitely be with your community in terms of your local environment. A lot of the things I see with the third house is that, and I've seen this with some ancient astrologers and they reference it too, is that it's the individual's homeland or the place that they're from. But I think if we even bring the context of the moon rejoicing in the third house, it's those who are our tribe. It's those who are, whether it be literally related to us, part of our tribe, part of our kin, our blood, or whether it be those who are in our local community. They're in our town, they're in our city, they're in our environment. They're in close proximity to us. Because the third is in close proximity to the fourth. Also, transportation and travel tend to be important with those things as well too. When Saturn in the fourth, though, this is definitely going to be more about crystallizing a sense of understanding of like the past, family, lineage, all things related to home, living situation, and trying to find more stability therein. Saturn in the fifth for this is definitely going to be about crystallizing understanding of children, understanding of your relationship to children, relationship to joy, relationship to sex, relationship to love, relationship to romance, and a little bit more rigor that's kind of or longevity that's being sought out for that. Saturn return in the sixth. One of the more common experiences of the Saturn return is because Saturn is a planet of sobriety and graveness or somberness. Saturn is very serious, so there tends to be this idea where the Saturn return comes around people if they've been dealing with drugs, if they've been dealing with alcohol, if they've been dealing with substances. We typically can see the Saturn return as this moment where people tend to want to take more care of their health. So that looks like maybe cutting back on alcohol, cutting back on drugs, needing to live a more sober lifestyle. Definitely a product of the Saturn return, especially when it's in the sixth house. In the seventh house, this definitely brings major change towards your relationships, towards partnerships. Sometimes the seventh house can represent lawsuits, so I do want to bring that up, but other times it can represent marriage, it can represent spouses and partnerships too. All going to be depending on the chart. If it's in the eighth house, Saturn brings the topics of crystallizing a relationship with inheritance, with other people's money, with other people's resources. Also, this idea of the dead, ancestors, genealogy, things that are inherited from the dead. We all see these kind of from the fourth and eighth, especially Saturn coming into the eighth too. Saturn return coming into the ninth, though, there is much more of a development in crystallization of faith, of spiritual discipline, of spiritual practice. The ninth house is the house of, it was originally labeled the house of God. So it talks about this idea of there being a God, such as a divine entity or being. So it could be God, gods, depending on your belief. Any and all astrologers, divination, we see all of that taking place in the ninth house. And there is much more of I definitely have noticed Saturn coming through my ninth house is also a big period of study and education as well, too. I mean, Saturn return for people, definitely major moment with study and education in the ninth as well. If it's in career, definitely big moment for those Gemini risings with Saturn in the 10th house about career and trying to establish or create more stability and create a foundation for what the next 30 years will be like. And really think about that for the Saturn return. Like with Saturn, you cannot think in the short term. Saturn will not allow you to. Saturn is, and this is the big thing also about Saturn in terms of its significations too. Saturn is all about forethought and considering the consequences of your actions. And so for that reason, Saturn often inhibits because it makes people fearful or timid of, which action or which choice is, I guess, the more fair or more just. But yeah, Saturn in the 11th, there is much more of an emphasis on trying to build a foundation of community and trying to build a foundation of friends and a network of people. And then if it's in the 12th house, it's definitely this moment of retreat, this moment of solitude, this moment of also dealing with enemies. Sometimes if Saturn's dignified, it can indicate overcoming your enemies as well too, especially if it's in a day chart. But it can also indicate periods of isolation and periods of confinement, even if Saturn is in a more challenging position as well too. I did want to talk about Saturn, the other Saturn signs, because one, I have Saturn in Gemini, and I know Stella in here has Saturn in Gemini. I know other people in this room have Saturn in Gemini. There's some people who have Saturn in Sagittarius as well too, and I think it's going to be really interesting to see this kind of Saturn square come for us, because if you look at Saturn in Sagittarius, for example, this is going to be their opening Saturn square. So Saturn and Sag would have had their Saturn return take place in 2015 to 2017 when Saturn was in Sagittarius, and this is kind of this first moment. If you have Saturn and Sag, you should be at least 35 by now. I don't think you're either 35 or you're 5. So you're either 35 or you will be 7.5. So, oh my God, that's kind of crazy to think about. Kids born in like 2015 to 2017, whatever. Oh my gosh, we're getting old up here. But Saturn in yeah, people going through Saturn and Sagittarius, they're going through this opening Saturn square. And so it is definitely this moment where, and I think this is also this opening Saturn square is where we really see post Saturn return, a lot of the action start to come up because it's at this first Saturn return, this first Saturn square that happens usually around like 35 to 36, 37 ish. It's usually at the Saturn square that it also coincides with the Jupiter return, but it also coincides with the nodal return as well too. So you'll usually get a nodal return. I think it's 18, and then it's around 18, 19, and then again at 30. I think it's 36. I can't do math right now. Let me see. 18 plus 18. Yeah, it's 36. So you get the minor period of Jupiter activated at 35. Once again, I think it's the third Jupiter return. You get the Saturn square, and then you get the nodal return. So it's a big moment for Saturn in Sag people. They're definitely kind of emerging after this. They're kind of emerging and starting this, I guess, new, I don't want to say necessarily challenge, but I do want to say challenge. But the way I look at it is that when Saturn is in these hard aspects to your natal Saturn, these are periods of growing pains. And so this first Saturn square that happens when you're 7.5 years old, this is your first growing pain where you become really aware of restrictions, you become really aware of limits, and really aware of certain things you can and cannot do, but on a very kind of childlike level. When you come to this Saturn opposition, this is when there's this kind of pull or this tug. Like there's not necessarily like this unequal portion or unequal contention that you're kind of dealing with, just because the square does not represent an equal contention or an equal challenge. There usually is someone who has the upper hand or is influencing the situation more. Whereas during this opposition, what we'll see for the Saturn and Virgo, for example, this is where there definitely is this tension or this moment where there is a restriction or a restraint or a limit that is maybe not completely what they're used to, or it's they're kind of dealing with this opposite end of the spectrum of what their Saturn is representing. I know my Saturn opposition for me was actually the peak of my Saturn opposition was actually my discovery of astrology, because Saturn is the lord of my ninth house. And so these are also the things you want to pay attention to as well, too. You especially want to pay attention to what houses Saturn rules. Regardless, for any hard aspect of Saturn, but especially if you have mutable Saturns. I'll share my experience with this because I have Saturn in a mutable sign. And I noticed that it was when 7.5 came around the time of my first Saturn square, that I actually started to get into astrology when I was around. We all do as a kid. Some people do as a kid, but it's kind of funny because Saturn was in Virgo during that time, and I only knew that I was a Virgo. So it was a moment where I heavily identified with that Virgo archetype in my life. Not so much anymore, even though I do, but not here to talk about myself. But then when Saturn comes into Sagittarius in 2015 to 2017, it's the peak of my Saturn opposition. Literally the peak of the opposition. It was actually on a Venus Cazimi, which is actually, I was talking to Mo about this. Was I talking to Mo about this? I think I was talking to you about this, Mo. But I was talking about how that Venus Cazimi in Gemini, the exterior conjunction, exactly on the degree of my Saturn, also exactly the Saturn opposition, is I have the exact time and date of when I found my birth chart. Venus Cazimi at 14 Gemini on the degree of my natal Saturn. So that Saturn opposition was definitely this big tension and this big moment of really faith for me, because it was in Pisces. It was in a Jupiter ruled sign. To kind of give a little context for people about me, that I did not grow up religious. I did not grow up kind of believing in any faith or anything. I was not atheist, but non-religious, I guess is how I would describe it. And it was really this moment of the Saturn opposition where I was like, oh shit, this is something I am developing a belief or an understanding of in, and it's kind of fucking crazy how well it works. So it was 2016 when I first found astrology, in terms of my birth chart and this whole system I'm studying now. And then it's really interesting because, again, what I've noticed is that these Saturn squares, they can definitely represent, or not even Saturn square, the whole Saturn cycle. You usually want to pay attention to the squares and the oppositions because those will be the more pivotal moments in the cycle. But these are definitely moments where, based on the houses that Saturn rules, you will find developments with those houses at each moment of that square or that opposition. And the reason why that's important is because those houses run on Saturn's time. So if you got Saturn running your first house, you are literally going to be moving slower through life. If Saturn rules your 7th house, your relationships and your partnerships are on Saturn's time. And that's every 2.5 years you're seeing these changes or these slow transitions. If Saturn rules your 10th, your career is running on Saturn's time. And so every time you see this hard aspect to Saturn, whether it be the opposition or the square, and by the way, I don't view oppositions and squares as totally challenging. Yes, they can be very challenging sometimes, not denying that, but there is this moment of push and this moment of, I almost think of this moment of a square of Saturn, whether it's Saturn. Again, it is this idea of growing pains. It's kind of what I have this section kind of blocked out as. But it's like this moment where the seed has to kind of push against the earth, and it germinates, and it sprouts. It's kind of funny because spring is also a very violent time in nature. Nature is very aggressive in the spring. All this shit is bursting out from the ground, pushing up. It's very martial energy that comes in the spring. Also, why Saturn doesn't like it. Because Saturn typically likes to do nothing. Not do nothing, but Saturn would much rather not be in the sign of Aries. So let's see. What was I talking about there? So yeah, you definitely want to pay attention to those hard aspects of Saturn. There are definitely major moments of push, and there are major moments of developing either better understanding, developing a better depth of knowledge, gaining more wisdom, gaining more insight. Those Saturn squares are definitely they're some of your more pivotal moments in your life. So again, in your first Saturn cycle, that's around 7 to 9, 14 to 16, 21 to 23, and then 28 to 30, and then again 35 to 37. I don't know when the Saturn opposition goes exact again. Actually, let me do 14 plus 30. I could just do that. Yeah, so we got like 44 to 46-ish. And then we get 21 plus 30. Oh my gosh. And then we get like 51 to like 53 as like the next part of the next Saturn cycle. So Saturn and Gemini, this is definitely so we talked about Saturn and Sagittarius. This is kind of their introduction to this new Saturn cycle and this new major moment of push. It's also a Jupiter return that'll be coming up. So most of these people should have like, I think Jupiter and Taurus as well too. Either Jupiter and Taurus or Jupiter and Aries. And for Saturn and Gemini, Saturn in Pisces will be in this overcoming position. So this is almost kind of like a climax or a culmination of the past, 30 years of your life. Not 30 years. I think by this point it'll be 21 if you're my age. But if you're not my age and you're a little bit older and you're like 51, it'll be the culmination of the past 21-ish years of your life. And I don't know, I think it'll be really interesting to see how Saturn is in this overcoming position to the natal Saturn. So, or transiting Saturn is overcoming the natal Saturn. So it is kind of these restrictions, these rules, these limits, and these responsibilities are kind of weighing heavily down upon you during that time for the Saturn in Gemini. Whereas Saturn in Sagittarius is more focused on either creating or initiating those rules, those boundaries, those restrictions. And all in Pisces too. It's going to be really interesting to see kind of what that entails. I think a lot of my just kind of guesses and predictions of what Saturn in Pisces is going to bring is that I think it's going to bring a lot of, one, being a planet of indulgence, being a sign of indulgence, being a sign of comfort, being a sign of kind of relaxation. It almost feels like Saturn's kind of giving us a little bit more discipline or giving us a little bit more of a, I guess, understanding of the things that are, I guess, bad for us or the things that are not good for us. I feel like there's going to be more of an inclination towards sobriety or towards self-restraint in indulgence, just because Saturn is coming into, this very heavy Venus-Jupiter sign. I think a lot of it is also going to be developing a lot more spiritual discipline and spiritual faith as well, too. I think we're going to see some major strides and some major waves kind of come in the astrology community as well, too. I can't be completely certain, though, if this is going to be for good or for worse, because part of me, the Saturn in me is like, okay, Saturn coming into Pisces, I could see this either as being more formalization around spirituality or more organization around spirituality, spiritual community. I could also see this as the enforcing of restrictions or the enforcing of boundaries or the enforcing of restraint of how spirituality, on how divination, and how religious practices are actually practiced, with Saturn kind of being in here during that time. It brings these restrictive, every house that Saturn is going to go through, it brings this restrictive, it brings this slow quality. And so with Saturn here, definitely. We're also seeing, I know we mentioned this earlier in the talk as well too, Saturn and Pisces being around issues with water, issues with coasts. I think we're going to be seeing a lot of issues with global warming personally with Saturn and Pisces. We're already seeing it right now. I live in Florida, and for those who don't know, at least where I am at, we are below sea level in Florida, and we just had a hurricane recently pass, and I've been just riding around everywhere through my car, and I've been looking at all the places that are flooded in my neighborhood, because originally the place I live was beachside property. It was like beachfront, and you know what? It might be beachfront again. And I don't say that to be super pessimistic or like a Debbie Downer of things, but Saturn is letting us know time is ticking, especially as Saturn is going to be responding to Jupiter in Taurus. It's really funny how Taurus is all coming back to kind of be this very central topic, especially in 2023. Because, we just had Mars go through Taurus. We're having Uranus go through Taurus. We're having the eclipses go through Taurus. We're having, Rahu go through Taurus right now. We're going to have Jupiter go through Taurus, the Mercury retrograde. We just had Mercury did a brief retrograde through Taurus, but in 2023, it'll do a full retrograde through Taurus. These themes of labor, these themes of work, these themes of nourishment, the planet. I think this, a lot of also Jupiter kind of coming into Taurus is going to have to be addressing these issues of instability within resources as a result of climate change. And I think what we're going to start seeing with Saturn, especially around the Mars-Saturn conjunction in Pisces, that one happens, it's hot in here during that eclipse. And I think in particular, it's going to be in that eclipse in 2024, we start to see more disasters around water and around coastlines and around things of that nature. That eclipse is going to be a solar eclipse in Aries, ruled by Mars in Pisces, making an exact conjunction to Saturn in Pisces. This dissolution of structure and the abundance of water, or the calamity of water that it creates towards structure and society. These are very real things that we can see, and it's not things that we should ignore either, because I love the planet. I don't know about you. I would hope that you love the planet as well too. And there is time that is ticking out. And I think that there's going to be a lot of, and this is also the thing I also think this is going to be discussed in terms of climate change, because these are all connected. Climate change, white supremacy, imperialism, capitalism, patriarchy, all of these things are intertwined. And I think Saturn and Pisces is especially going to be addressing issues of the rise of Christian fascism, especially in the United States. It's kind of really interesting as I was reading earlier, because I was talking about how Saturn in, I think it was, who did I mention it? I think it was, I forgot who mentioned it, but it was one of the ancient authors, and they were saying yes, specifically Christianity does get this, originally actually it got this association with Sagittarius, but then slowly moved over towards becoming associated with Pisces. I think there's going to be a lot more addressing, or a lot more restriction that is going to be brought towards those, who are quote unquote practicing religion. Don't think that they are, but that's just my opinion. And I think that the misinformation that is particularly spread around those who practice religion, that's going to be the big tension of 2024. Because Saturn and Jupiter will officially square each other by 2024. And so, again, this major tension between faith, devotion, religious practice, all the things we kind of talked about. Jupiter being Gemini, there is this, whereas typically Jupiter tends to affirm belief or affirm knowledge, there is this contradiction in the truth that we see with Jupiter and Gemini here. And we see it because of this kind of heaviness or this weightiness that's coming with Saturn in Pisces. So it's definitely a lot. Saturn in Pisces is going to be definitely a huge vibe shift. I have not lived through a Saturn and Pisces transit. I know there are some older folks here who probably have. I'm really excited to. I'm really excited to hear other people's like thoughts and ideas of Saturn and Pisces because, I mean, again, Saturn being in its domicile over the past 5 years, and then going into this position of not having any dignity of all, it's something we are not going to be able to ignore. And I don't know. I'm very excited for it, and I'm very excited to see what comes up. I'm excited for me because it's my Saturn square. I'm excited to see kind of what predictions come true. I'm excited for Saturn to let loose a little bit, but maybe a little too loose. I don't know. We'll see. We'll eventually see because it does look like it's going to be quite a doozy. But we are kind of at like this last 10 minutes marks of the talk. So I did kind of ask some people some questions on Twitter, and I do want to kind of answer them. I have like around 6 questions kind of pre-picked out here. So I wanted to go through them and just answer them really quickly. And so this is from Jsean at underscore Jsean underscore or no at Jsean underscore. They say that I know that Saturn figuratively is going to make me quote unquote grow up, but is it really a time where things get terrible for the sake of your own growth, or is it calmer than that? Would it be different for someone Saturn ruled also like Capricorn or Aquarius? A great question. I think Saturn is this moment, I guess, of growing up, but the Saturn return is the moment where it can make you grow up or bring a lot more maturity. But, I think it's definitely, it's a moment not necessarily where you have to confront your own mortality, because I think a lot of that comes in the second Saturn return, but it is a moment where Saturn is giving you a reminder that your time is limited here, and that there is this time, and there is the idea of kind of how do you want to lay a foundation for your life. Typically Saturn can give you more virtue, I guess. If you, I don't say necessarily if you're Saturn ruled, but more if Saturn is dignified in your chart, and if Saturn is in a more positive circumstance or situation. I think if you have Saturn in Aquarius though, or Capricorn, you're going to have a little bit more positive experiences with Saturn. Again, day or night, definitely going to matter. But I don't think necessarily, I always felt a little bit uncomfortable with, I guess, this kind of sadistic understanding that people have of Saturn, kind of making them suffer just for things to get better. And I don't think that's necessarily what Saturn's trying to describe. I think Saturn will typically describe, if there is suffering, it indicates that there are binds and there's constrictions and there's restraints that are existing, that are being pulled to an excess of restriction. And that's the thing. Saturn's restraints can sometimes be in excess too. And sometimes these commitments can kind of be in excess as well too. And so it is this moment at the Saturn return, as if you are experiencing calamity, it might be a sign that there's too much of Saturn in that area of life. And with everything in astrology and everything in life, moderation is always necessary. So I don't think it's necessarily this time, again, where things are going to be super terrible for the sake of you getting better. I think the goal is to lay more foundation, whether that process is going to be more challenging or more fruitful. It will depend not only on your life, but also how your own actions and what you choose to do with it. I mean, this is the moment where you have the choice now. This is the final planet that has not been activated in your chart in its full completion of its minor period. Because by the time you're 25, you would have had all the minor periods of the planet activated. So Mercury's at 20, the moon's at 25, the sun's at 19, Mars is at 15, Jupiter is at 12, Venus is at 8, and then the last one is Saturn. It really is this period of growing into wisdom and really coming into becoming an adult. I always tell my clients this, that in society we are legally considered an adult by 18. The way I interpret this is that we are considered an adult at 18 because it is deemed legal to work under capitalism at 18 without it being considered child labor. Not because you are an adult. I think it really is at this moment of 30 of the Saturn return that we come into our maturity and we come into this adulthood. And you know what? It puts a lot of pressure off of people when you look at it like that. because there is this heavy expectation to achieve, to, you know, kind of participate, I guess, in this idea of having all your shit together by 30. It's unrealistic, in my opinion, to have everything together by 30. But I do want to get into some other questions. I hope that provided some clarity. This next one is going to be from Bruja Talks Botanica. Some general advice. I think we kind of went over that. Things to try to avoid. I think one of the things to try to avoid during the Saturn return is Saturn can always represent, I guess, chronic or long-term like issues or like patterns, whether it be a behavior or things like that. And so falling into the same patterns of behavior might not be the like best thing to do. Like, I think this Saturn return is definitely, you know, a moment where you're able to kind of, again, try something different, try something new, and try something new through your own actions and through your own desire and through your own efforts and through your own work and your own labor. Bruja talked about how, you know, Saturn's going to be in their 10th house, so it's going to definitely be about like, you know, change and career. But I know I feel like especially Saturn in the 10th house, it really is this firming and establishing of career. It definitely is this moment to, I think, especially with Saturn, one of the things you want to do is up your standards. Saturn is like, okay, look, you are entering into the world of adults now. We do things differently here than we do in adolescence. So, especially, you know, maybe if it's career, whatever the case might be, scarcity is not always bad. You know, limiting the connections you can have with certain people or limiting the types of interactions you have with people. The Saturn return is all about self-restraint and self-discipline too. Not falling into the same traps or the same patterns of behavior, you know, that may have created more issues for you before. This is a moment of emerging out of, I guess, the ignorance of adolescence. But yeah, so I want to then go to Sinta Sulu. Their question was, what if you've been having a lot of sudden life-changing stuff before your Saturn return? I heard it's supposed to be the most trying and shocking time of your life. So this is definitely a really great question because, you know, I think one of the biggest things, I guess, about life and Saturn and everything is that there is this idea of, even though someone is not at their Saturn return, you know, people can have like really crazy life experiences and go through so many things. And people can definitely become a lot more aged even in adolescence as a result of trauma, life experience, things of that nature. And so let's say you have had a lot of these things kind of go on in your life up until you're 30. What does that Saturn return bring? And so the way I kind of would interpret that Saturn return is, if you've been having a lot of volatility or a lot of sudden life changes, this would be a moment where Saturn is trying to bring you stability and trying to bring you a rest and trying to bring you some sort of level of permanence. You know, depending on where Saturn is in the chart, it will try to bring you some level of permanence to the volatility that has kind of already been existing. So I think it's definitely it's a moment of slowing down too. And with slowing down, it's finding the nice place to kind of settle in. A nice place to settle into. So yeah, it's I don't think it's necessarily the most shocking time of your life. It can definitely be a very trying time. Saturn transits are always going to require some level of work and require some level of rigor, some level of effort. I love the word rigor. I have to credit Zachary Powell for that word in connotation with Saturn, because they also, one, are very Saturnian. But Saturn is it really is a planet of rigor. It's a planet of hard work, but it's also a planet of the willingness to put in the hard work and the willingness to put in the discipline as well too. And, you know, it's, you know, the discipline and the hard work is not always easy, but because Saturn is exalted in the sign of Libra, discipline and hard work is necessary for devotion. And I mean, this is why also, like, you know, religious stuff gets associated with Venus as well too. I mean, Saturn's exaltation being there, a big part of what Saturn was, you know, originally represented is people who practice incredible self-discipline within their religion and within their faith. So definitely a moment. It's definitely a moment where it's trying, because Saturn is testing you to see if you will fall and make the same decisions and patterns and behaviors that you previously did. And um, Saturn will test you in being able to say no. This is the moment in really people's lives where they learn the power of the word no. So, again, not necessarily shocking, but it is definitely, I mean, it's a revolution. Any sort of planetary return is a revolution. That's why they're called solar revolutions. It's the sun revolving and completing a revolution around the sun. And a revolution, if you go to that word, it's a major change that takes place. And so I mean, if you even actually look up the word revolution right now, we'll define it. But yeah, no. It is this, dramatic change, and it's the signaling of really endings and beginnings as it happens, because Saturn is closing the previous cycle out, but also starting something new at the same time too. So we have that. I hope that was insightful. And then one of our other questions was, is this when COVID ends? Because Saturn in Aquarius, I see you. And this is from CK Itak. So is this when COVID ends? This is some tea, because I've been thinking of when is this pandemic going to be over? And I originally thought, okay, maybe it's just going to be the duration of, the Mars-Saturn conjunction in Aquarius, the first one that happened at 0 Aquarius. And then that cycle was over, and then the new variants started popping up, and I was like, okay, maybe it'll be the end of Saturn in Aquarius. I don't think it's going to be the end of Saturn in Aquarius, truthfully. I think it's going to be a much longer 20-year cycle, truthfully, that we're going to have to deal with COVID. And the reason I say that is because of the Saturn-Jupiter conjunction in Aquarius. That Saturn-Jupiter conjunction right there at like 101 Aquarius. Also near the degree where the Mars-Saturn conjunction originally took place. The interpretation of that Mars-Saturn conjunction is pestilent winds, and winds in air that is harmful. And so if Saturn-Jupiter conjunctions are starting a new 20-year cycle, I wonder, my prediction and my guess, and I will say that I don't feel completely confident in it, but my prediction is that potentially this is going to be a much longer 20-year cycle that we're going to see. But I think we're going to especially see developments next year when Pluto hits that 0 degrees of Aquarius, and kind of reveals more of the hidden natures of these things around COVID, around pretty much COVID. We are at the hour, though, so if there are any other questions or comments or anything that anyone has, feel free to tweet at me. I will try to get to all of these either tomorrow or sometime during the weekend. It's been such a pleasure to go over Saturn and Pisces and just kind of do a little bit of a preview. And yeah, really presenting here. And I just want to say thank you to the organizers of KazemiCon, and to everyone who's able to make this possible. And I also want to thank you to everyone who has consistently stayed in here throughout the entire 2 hours. Thank you for listening to me literally ramble, but also, do this talk. And I also do want to say, though, that if you do want to keep up with the astro weather, I do have a newsletter. It's a free newsletter you can subscribe to. And it's I think it's the first thing in the Jumbotron, but it is the week ahead horoscope. And so every Monday I will email out to your inbox day-by-day analysis of what's going on in the astro weather, what you can pay attention to, and delineations of the current transits. If you subscribe to the monthly edition, which was $12 a month, you'll get some monthly forecasts in there as well, and help me support and provide the astro weather for y'all. But it's been such a pleasure to bring this to KazemiCon today, and thank you so much. And I think I should end the space now then, correct, Stella? Okay, perfect. I will end the space now. The recording will be available, so if you did come in late, you can always just catch the recording. But other than that, I hope everyone has a great night, and I will be floating around on the other talks all night. So hope to see everyone there. Take care. Bye.